You're watching BrainStormAcres. I'm Henry.
And I'm Irene.
And today we're going to talk about what we showed yesterday, which was some tree cutting done by the U.S. Forest Service.
One of the things we've emphasized in a lot of our videos in the past is that just because something works one place doesn't mean it works someplace else. You have to be total, even within the same state, there are all kinds of environments. On the East Coast, you have some areas that will be wet, and some areas that will be dry, and hilly, and runoff, and all these sort of things. Well, the same thing here.
Well, it's only worse. One of the problems here, actually, when it comes to all that cutting that you saw yesterday, well, first of all, more than 10 years ago, I was on our local landowners association board of directors. Now, that's not at all like a homeowners association. It was really a group of people banding together to maintain our roads and things like that.
And also to be heard by the politicians.
And that's a big thing. When you live someplace where there's not a local government.
Yeah, we are not an incorporated town or anything like that. So.
Yes, so when you live someplace where you're not in part of an incorporated government, politicians tend to not pay attention. More than 10 years ago, when I was dealing with the U.S. Forest Service, what I discovered was they were busy using this cutting technique up in northern Arizona, where there's about the same amount of rainfall as we have here, but it happens at different times of the year. And the time of year is really, really important. Now, the other thing is, the biologist who is responsible for the program had never been here.
No, he'd never even been down here. He's based up in like Flagstaff or Williams or someplace, which is a totally different climate than we have. They are big ponderosa pine forests up there.
And we're not.
Not even sorta.
So, some of the trees that you saw yesterday were more than 40 years old. We have trees that were cut on our property, that were actually pushed over on our property by bulldozers, probably at least 60 years ago, some of them 70 years ago.
We're cutting them for firewood.
They haven't rotted.
Yeah, just the very bottom branches that were actually on the ground have finally sort of, it's almost dry rot. They like disintegrate eventually, but there's still a lot of wood there that's actually viable. I've cut a whole stack of it as firewood.
So the important thing about what happened here and what's happening here still is that the Forest Service is coming along to, quote, improve grazing. Now, the only thing that really grazes out here, for real, are cows. And that's something that's managed through the BLM. It's not managed by the Forest Service, but they're busy cutting the trees to improve grazing. Well, and the funny thing is, when you look at those trees that they're cutting, where does the grass grow? It's around the drip line of the tree.
Right, and if you watch, and they're all concerned about, they say they want to improve the grazing for ungulates. Okay, ungulates are critters that have more than one stomach and therefore regurgitate and rechew and all that other stuff. Okay, that includes antelope and cows. Do elk chew their cuds? I don't know.
I don't know, but I think so. I have to look it up.
I have to look that one up. But we do have elk here. So I could understand them wanting to improve the grazing for elk and antelope because those are a natural species, something that they want to encourage. And actually the largest contiguous antelope open area, as a range, is south of us, down in Chino Valley. And they have done big programs that are cooperative with the ranchers and stuff to allow the antelope free passage and all that kind of stuff like that. Well, keeping the horses and cows where they belong.
If you look at the land around here, there's no topsoil because the trees were knocked down, and there's going to be no topsoil out where the trees were taken down here by the U.S. Forest Service.
Right, and when Henry and the other group 10 years ago contacted the Forest Service, they're like, oh, well, we're improving the grazing, and they're like, have you ever been here? Well, no. They didn't even know what the area looked like. They didn't realize it was a Pinon juniper forest. And the guy who had been hired to do the work was supposed to be knocking down everything. He was supposed to be clear cutting. And he wasn't even touching what we call desert holly, which is actually a bearberry. And is like, think about holly, except every leaf is only that big, and every point on that leaf has a 1/4-inch spine on it. He wasn't taking those down. They're not good for browse. They're not good for much of anything else. You know, he wasn't taking those down because he didn't want to get stuck.
The way they take down these trees is they use a skid steer loader that has a special cutting attachment on the front of it. They drive the skid steer up to the base of the tree. They cut the tree down and they just leave it.
Yeah.
And really, at the end of it all, apart from the fact that what they're doing is not ecologically sound, the big beef I have is that they cut the tree down and they leave it, and it doesn't rot.
No, it'll take decades, quite literally, to rot. Meanwhile, it's a great place for rats to live. It's not improving anything. If they wanted to improve it, there are things they could do.
There's 12 miles. 12 miles of road that the trees that are beyond the edge of the road have been cut. The ones up close to the road haven't been cut, but the ones a little bit further back have been cut.
Yeah, there's this whole strip there that's just gone.
And it's just laying there. And the problem with that is that when these trees brown off, they're on the ground, they brown off, they become a fire hazard.
Huge fire hazard.
Now, when you look at a video that I'll be putting up when we're flame weeding our yard, you'll see how fast the dry grass around here catches fire and moves quickly.
Right.
So I look at it and say, you needed to have a plan to deal with that wood when you cut it down. They don't. What they rely on are firewood cutters who will go into Williams to get a permit to go cut the trees.
Well, there aren't as many around here as there used to be. When the whole crackdown on immigrants happened, most of the immigrants who worked in the quarries here left. But also, the economy tanked, the quarries closed, and they all left and went to someplace else. Well, what they used to do is they used to work in the quarry during the week, and on the weekends they would cut firewood and sell it as a sideline again. There's nobody here doing that hardly anymore.
Now the problem with cutting this wood, which is primarily juniper wood, which is a type of cedar, the primary problem with cutting that for firewood is it's really hard to gain access. If it's at all wet in some of these areas, you can't get to it because the clay turns into soup. And the bigger problem is when you have a downpour and you have water go into some of these gullies, it will stay mucky and muddy for more than a month.
Mm-hmm.
And on top of all of that, cutting this stuff is hard work. You don't get a whole lot of firewood for a lot of effort.
These are spiky, funky, giant bushes is all they are. And they make fine firewood. We use it all the time ourselves. But they're not efficient in terms of creating firewood. So if they take anything, all they do is take the big stuff and leave the littler stuff because it takes forever to get a face cord out of little stuff.
Yeah, so an awful lot of my beef with what you saw yesterday was there's no plan to deal with the slash that comes off those trees. It was probably 10 or 12 years ago when I had the issue with the Forest Service the last time. We were in a extreme fire danger condition then, and all of these trees that had been cut down, or that started cutting down on the entrance into our subdivision, were just left there, and they dry out quickly, and that became a recipe for disaster. So we raised the dickens with them and got them to stop. And we also pointed out that our area here is not the same climate, it's not the same rain pattern as happens in Williams, or more importantly, on the part of Arizona where they were doing this large-scale effort to improve the grazeland for primarily antelope and elk. Cows can go in and browse as well.
Well, they also run sheep in the national forest.
But the point was to improve the elk and antelope. When you do that, you'll increase the numbers of antelope and elk. And the problem with that is whenever we have a drought or a really dry season, you have to haul water in to keep the elk from dying of thirst, dying of lack of water. And 2 years ago, the city of Flagstaff brought in, I think, 1 million gallons
Something
of water.
like that. They had to completely refill a lake because basically they had two choices. The elk herd was going to die, and then they were going to be dealing with a large pile of dead carcasses. And elk are big animals. They are like the size of a cow. They decided that this would be really bad for tourism if the whole place smelled like a dead elk. So they had to actually bring in huge quantities of water.
There's a lot of things that are wrong with the program that the Forest Service has undertaken in this part of Arizona. And we can go into exhaustive detail, but we're not going to. There is another takeaway for those of us who are homesteaders, and that is just like when I was showing you the erosion problems on our property and water movement on our property, you can look at the vegetation where you live and you can make some determinations. If you see a tree that is old and has been on the ground for a long time and is not rotting, that tells you one thing, and that's what we see around here. There is one big takeaway for everybody who is a homesteader or is looking at property to buy for a homestead, and that is pay attention to not just the water erosion patterns and where the wind comes from, but also what kind of vegetation you have in the area. You can tell a lot about the land by looking at the vegetation. Now, if you're in the deep south where you have a lot of moisture, good quality or at least moderate quality soil, or at least some topsoil with some humus in it, that's one thing. If you're in the desert southwest where there's not much humus, and there's definitely not much topsoil where we live, that's another story. If we look at some of the trees that were knocked down on our property 60 or 70 years ago, those trees were 60 or 70 years old to start with. They're not real big. They're perhaps 12 to 14 inches in diameter. They don't grow fast here because there's not a tremendous amount of rainfall at the right time of year. So there's a lot of things that you can learn. Well, in any case, we hope that you found this at least of some interest to you and explained some of what we see as being something that you need to watch out for.
I see a lot of people buy property that's up against public lands because they're confident that their land will never be encroached on that side. First of all, that public land can be sold in many states unless there's specific rules against it. Both the feds and the states have the right to sell that land in most instances, unless it was granted to them with the condition that they never sell it. So you need to be aware of what the law is in your own state as to what can be done with that land. There are places where that land will be kept green in perpetuity, but that doesn't necessarily mean that what's going on there is still good for you. You need to be aware, that's all.
A lot of this really comes home for us because of where we live. And we see the effects of decisions that were made 60, 70, 80 years ago
And
that are still long-lasting. They're still here. We're still living with them. So, we hope you found this of some value and some interest. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe if you like what we did here. And have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.